Hello, everyone. I'm Beverly Bond, founder of Black Girls Rock, and I'm so excited to be back here again to bring you another episode of the BGR Book Club in partnership with Microsoft. The BGR Book Club is designed to build and promote community, empowerment, literacy, and leadership. And each month we select a new inspirational and thought-provoking book for our BGR community to read and discuss. And today we'll be discussing the critically acclaimed New York Times bestseller book, The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped the Nation by Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs. Dr. Tubbs will be joined by our very own BGR alumni from class of 2014 and 2015, Melanie Graves. Melanie is a 2021 graduate of Wellesley College with a BA in Economics and African American Studies. She is currently a wealth management analyst with the Bank of America Private Bank in Manhattan, New York, and we're so proud of her. Please welcome Melanie Graves.
Thank you, Ms. Bev, and welcome everyone. We're so happy to be here today. I'm delighted to talk to and be the lead on this conversation with the amazing Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs. Her book is amazing. If you haven't read it yet, we're going to get into it today, but pick up a copy, get to reading. It's truly an exceptional read. And without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Anna say hello, and we'll get into some questions.
Hi, all. My voice. Good morning. I am so excited to be here. Well, it's morning for me. I know it's afternoon for some of you. I'm in California, but I am just really honored to be in conversation with Melanie, really honored to be here with such an incredible organization, Black Girls Rock, kind of a dream come true for me. So I just am excited to jump into it, and I hope you all enjoy today's discussion.
Wonderful. Well, to jump right in, I think it's really important that before we get to know the text, we get to know the author. So Anna, I wanted to talk to you about who you are, your journey in becoming a PhD candidate and now a doctor, and also in becoming a writer and an author. Where have you seen yourself grow, and what has that journey been like for you, and as it pertains to the audience?
Absolutely. So I'll try to keep it short because there's so much that goes into each of our stories. Of course, you know, our parents who raised us, where we were born. So I'll kind of give a quick summary and then talk a little bit about how I arrived at the book. So I'm 29 years old. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but both my parents were lawyers. So they wanted to actually practice their law outside of the US so that their kids, my siblings and I, could travel with them. So we had this incredible privilege of moving from place to place every couple of years. I lived in places like Dubai, Estonia, Sweden, Mexico, Azerbaijan. I lived in a place called Laramie, Wyoming as well when I came back to the States when I was 13 years old. So I'd been gone for 10 years. And then I went to boarding school actually for the last 2 years of high school. I was in Indiana. My parents wanted to go abroad again, and I wanted to stay and graduate in the US. And so I went to boarding school, and then I was very fortunate to be accepted into Stanford University. And I was there for 4 years, getting my bachelor's degree in anthropology. The reason I pursued anthropology was because I was already so exposed to different cultures. I really believed there was so much to understand about each individual by understanding where they grew up and what they grew up believing and how they were taught to live their life and love and all of these things through culture. So anthropology was my way of studying that more formally. And then I went to Cambridge University where I did my master's first in gender studies. So a lot of schooling, but it was all really fun because it was stuff I was really passionate about and interested in. I spent several years teaching after that, and then I was a college counselor while I was getting my PhD in sociology. So coming to this book, I was really inspired by Hidden Figures. So if anyone's seen that movie, the movie was based off a book also called Hidden Figures, written by an author named Margot Lee Shetterly. And I really loved this movie and this book, but I walked away feeling really angered that this was the first time we were hearing these women's names. And it wasn't a mistake that they hadn't been, kind of celebrated in our history. It wasn't like somebody said, oops, we forgot to tell you that Black women were the minds behind the space launch all along. It was very intentional to keep those stories from us. And as a young Black woman, I thought this would have been incredible for me to know as a young Black girl. And so I just wanted to be somebody who found other hidden figures and made sure that our stories were being celebrated, that there was an accurate representation of how we arrived as a nation where we are today. And so much of that is because of the work of Black women, Black girls, and it's just important that everybody knows that.
Great. That's really wonderful. And I think one quote, and I'm going to quote Dr. Tubbs, if that's all right with her.
Yeah, I'm all about it.
I'm going to pick out a quote from the introduction that I think is so important, and just getting into these three women who you have focused on so much in your book, Alberta King, Bernice Baldwin, and Louise Little. You say, while the sons have been credited with the success of Black resistance, the progression of Black thought, and the survival of the Black community, the three mothers who birthed and reared them have been erased, and this book fights that erasure. And I think that that's so important. Like you said, there are so many figures in our history that we don't know about. Their stories are not, easily attained. We just aren't familiar with them. And so I think something that would be interesting to talk about here is, how did you start to find out about these women? How did you begin to tell their story? Where did you begin? And what were some of the challenges along the way in trying to uncover this picture and make it as complete as possible?
It was incredibly difficult. And I always start by saying, it's just interesting that every year we celebrate MLK Day. It's right around his birthday. His birthday was January 15th. So we always celebrate the Monday that's closest to that. And yet we don't really stop and wonder who else was there that day that he was born, as if somehow he just did this on his own. So it's a really simple question, who was the woman who was there who birthed him that day? And why haven't we asked that question before? And so much of that is because so often women's stories are erased. We do not give women the same amount of credit that we give men in our history books. We spend a lot more time hearing about men in history rather than women. A lot of our books are written about men and not about women. A lot of our authors are men and not women. So that was something that I really wanted to correct, but it was very difficult because this lack of kind of prioritizing women's stories and young girls' stories made it so that I had to really dig deep to find any evidence of their lives. It was sort of like this puzzle that had not been taken care of and had kind of, the pieces been spread out all over the place. Some of them had been broken and some of them have been thrown away. This is how their lives were treated, as opposed to the men's lives, the sons' lives. This is more of a puzzle that's been put together and put on a frame and kept so beautifully. So I was going around picking up those pieces as much as I possibly could. And there's definitely gaps in the story still. I couldn't interview these women, but the way that I approached it was first going to the sons' works, the books that have been written about them, the books that they wrote, speeches that they gave, finding little pieces of evidence around the women's stories. And then I had to contact local researchers in the places where they lived, where they were born. I had to find birth certificates, death certificates, land deeds, so these pieces of documents that say this was owned by this family, kind of tracing the history of each city. So it took several years to follow kind of the crumbs and put together this book. And each paragraph, it's almost made up of 4 different sources. For me to tell one story about the women, I had to include interviews with the family members, as well as these documents, and kind of go from there. I was also able to find letters that the sons had written where they referenced their mothers. And it was really a magical experience, but definitely not an easy one. Very worthwhile, and we need more of us to do this from our perspective so that we see the evidence of people like us in ways that others might not. But I was looking for the stories of women, Black women, who I felt like I would be able to find in a way that other people might not be able to.
That's really great. And I think one remarkable thing that you do through this text is show how their lives are in conversation with one another, and how their battles and their challenges and their victories and their successes are all, they mirror one another, even though they are vastly different in many regards as well. And so I wanted to talk to you about that aspect and how you were able to weave that, or what was the process like of breaking everything down? Once you have all of this evidence, once you figure out, okay, these are 3 stories, what was the process of putting them into conversation with one another? And also, if you could speak to how you then wove their sons into this text as well, because I think towards the end, when you say in your chapter, the circumstances of our death, it's amazing that you started that chapter off with quotes from their 3 sons, and were able to weave that into the stories of their deaths and what that meant, and what was the significance around that.
Yeah, that's such a powerful question. Well, first, I really wanted to make sure that we were emphasizing, and I was kind of making sure people knew that these 3 women were very different from each other, because quite often in books that Black women are represented in, if we are represented at all, it's as if we are what's called a monolith, as if we are just one group and everything that one of us does represents all of us. And this is actually a way that we've kind of, in the US, objectified Black women and Black girls by saying that we have no uniqueness from each other, that we're not different, that we can be represented in one category and put into one box. And I'm sure many of us have experienced that, where we feel, that's not my experience. I don't feel like I'm being represented. I feel like I'm being reduced to fit somebody else's notion of who I'm supposed to be. So I didn't want to do that in this book. I wanted to really celebrate the beautifully rich diversity of our Black womanhood and our Black girlhood, and making sure that we still are able to talk about ourselves as a community, but in a way that appreciates the complexities of our identity, because that's such a beautiful thing for us to celebrate. So that was very important to me. The way that I bring them together is also kind of thinking about how awful it is that despite our many differences and our backgrounds and our different access to resources, we're very much treated similarly in the US if we're Black girls, Black women, based off of this sexism as well as racism that tries to define us. And so I bring them together to talk about those experiences of Black womanhood, Black girlhood in America, and also through the timeline. So they were all born within 6 years of each other. And then their famous sons were all born within 5 years of each other. So I could bring these 3 very different stories together through time. So each chapter progresses through 10 years of the women's lives and 10 years of American history. So I think it's kind of cool because you get to see what's happening in the US through their lives, and through in the world through their lives, how they're experiencing, for instance, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, all these things that are happening in Black history, these incredible strides for our freedom. And then we see it play out in each of their individual lives. And then that second part of the question, relating it to their sons, you should know that this book really is mostly about the women. They are the stars of this book. I don't even really mention the sons until chapter 5, but you will see evidence of the sons even in those first chapters, because it's really obvious that what the women cared about, even when they were young girls, becomes so important for the men's lives later. So what the women were passionate about, what they were dreaming about becoming when they were teenagers, actually influences the way they mother their children, and influences their children to go on and kind of build on that and spread these ideas around the world. So I find that part to be really powerful, this constant connection, and this prioritization of the young girls, even when they're only teenagers, like many of you are, thinking about what you're going to do in your life, what you're passionate about, your talents are. All of that is so important, and much more important than us focusing immediately on who they married and who their kids were. It's who they were as individuals long before that.
Absolutely. And I think something that you just made me think of was this, also the importance of the idea of how the mothers gave to their sons what their sons gave to the world. And that's part of the reason why in this case, like it, and in all cases, of course, but it's so particularly impactful to hear their stories and to understand their origins and how they influence their sons. Because as I was reading, once you started bringing in some of their history and some of their family stories, you understand where things came from those famous people that, you know, we've been known to read. So, you know, I'm very familiar with MLK, I'm very familiar with Baldwin's work, I'm very familiar with Malcolm X, and to see where they came from and the undeniable impact that their mothers had on their lives is really, really just special as a young Black girl who will hopefully be a mother one day, right? Like thinking about how I can influence the next generation as well. And so something that I was thinking about in a quote that you had was you called Black mothers the generators of an alternative destiny. And you were speaking about, I think, how society tries to, you know, blame Black mothers for Black suffering while simultaneously never recognizing them for Black progress. But Black mothers have so many undeniable just successes across the board in raising children, and the things that they have to go through are unique to them and unique to their children that aren't the same for everyone else in our larger society. And so would you feel comfortable speaking to that in the context of Alberta, Burtis, and Louise, but maybe also as yourself as a mother now, where do you see yourself fitting into generating that alternative destiny for your children?
I love that question. That's so beautifully put. And just to give some background, since I know many of us haven't read the book yet, when we think about Black women, quite often in our country, it's only a representation of pain, of grief, of mourning. Quite often, if we see a Black mother on TV, it's because she has been robbed of one of her children. It's really this awful, ugly history in the United States. And it's important for us to focus on these burdens that have been placed on the shoulders of Black mothers and Black women. Yet in some way, we've missed the fact that Black women have found ways to challenge all of this pain and all of this violence that's been used against us. And that is also a crucial part of our story. We have not been defined by those who have tried, again, to confine us, but rather by the way in which we've fought against that, in which we've said, we are human beings, despite the fact that you keep trying to treat me like I am less than that. You keep trying to treat my children like we are less than that. And so even by law, Black mothers are the only ones who have been told that they were the givers of property rather than the givers of life. So their children, by law in US history, were the property of somebody else. So our motherhood was taken away from us from these early stages of American history. But Black women have continued to say, my children are human beings. I am a human being. And I have a vision for the world that is different from what the law is saying, from what all these other people who hate me are saying. And instead of me kind of assimilating to this notion that I am less than human, instead, I'm going to show you a path forward, and I'm going to fight for that vision to become reality. So that's what I'm saying in terms of Black mothers being the generators of an alternative reality. We've always been able to see beyond what the current situation is because we have to. That's a part of our survival. We can't accept things as they currently are because as they currently are, we're not being treated in the way that we deserve to be treated. So instead of, we sitting back and just not allowing that to happen, we have agency and we say, look at all the things we've done in history. Look at the transformation we've engendered in this world. And we need to continue to do that. And so it's definitely something that Alberta, Burtis, and Louise do for their children. They show them how ugly the world can be. They're living during Jim Crow. They can't hide from that fact. They can't tell their children nothing's wrong outside. They have to say, these are real things that you might face. There is hatred out there. There are people who will treat you differently. However, you don't have to be defined by that. You have a power to change this world. And here are some strategies that you can use. And also a third part of that is you're not alone in this. This is generations in the making. we've made strides, we have more to make. Lean on us, lean on your family, join us in this fight. And the final part of that, though, is that they also don't forget to allow their children to be joyful, to be happy, to rest, because all of that is really essential to our fight. The purpose of taking someone's humanity is to rob them of their joy, to rob them of their love. And so in Black families, when we continue to love, when we continue to be joyous, even while we're fighting, that is a part of our fight. It's really revolutionary for us to still find our happiness, love our families, when people have tried to take that from us for so many years.
Absolutely. And I think I want to just connect that to this idea of lives lost and things being taken away from the Black family and from Black mothers, especially when they do lose their children. Something that you said in your chapter about losing our sons, you said they needed to keep the light shining that they passed to their children, and that their lost children had now passed back to them. And I think that in today's time, we know so many stories of Black mothers who have lost children, and whether they be nationally known, locally known, someone in your family, a lot of Black women and Black people can know someone in their community who has suffered from that kind of loss. And so I wanted to speak to you about this idea of loving someone to light, and how you can be a part of that change in making that transition or that path forward easier for people around you. And if there's something key from Alberta, Berdice, and Louise's stories that you think point to how that can look.
There's so much to be said about that. And of course, it's so painful that all three of these mothers outlive their famous sons. We know, of course, that MLK is assassinated, that Malcolm X is assassinated, and that James Baldwin passes away from cancer later on, but before his mother passes. So this kind of worst nightmare for each of these moms becomes true. And in these moments of tragedy, of desperation, of the most intense pain that words can't even describe, they still want to focus on the fact that their children have created work that outlives them. Their children also, in the case of Martin and Malcolm, have children themselves, and these mothers want to be there for their grandchildren and teach them everything that they taught their own children. And they also still find that they have their role to continue to play. So their lives don't end in this moment, but they find it important to continue the legacy that, like I say in the book, they passed to their children, and their children had passed back on to them. But I also think it's important for us to not think that they were just these, this notion of the strong Black woman who can just hold it all together and take us more pain than anybody else. That's not the reality. They were distraught. They were broken apart. Their children had been taken from them. We have to still see them as human beings. We can't get used to and numb to the fact that so many Black mothers have lost their children before they themselves pass away. That is awful. And what I think we have to learn from this is there are so many systems that we have left to fix, left to transform. As a Black mother myself, I will not sit here and say it's an inevitable burden that I will have to carry. No, this is something that we need to change. And I will speak up about that to get more and more people on board with systemic change. It should not be accepted that so many Black mothers lose their children at the hands of police officers, at the hands of neighborhood vigilantes, at the hands of systems that have made it so inequitable for Black children to live full lives and be respected and be treated with dignity. But I am consoled by the fact that this is work we've been doing for generations. I think Alberta, Berdice, and Louise did their part, and it's also important for all of us to do our part as well so that progress can continue.
It's beautifully said, and I couldn't agree more. We must continue to work together to progress. And I want to just going to keep quoting you, but I want to
I love it.
I want to touch on the last chapter where you say our lives will not be erased, and we're talking about legacy. I think if I could sum up that chapter in one word, we're really grappling with the idea of legacy, and I think that you've so well touched on and talked about this monolith and trope of like the strong Black woman, the strong Black mother, the Black mother who resisted, who persisted, but also gave them characteristics that we maybe don't always think about, thinking about the individualistic things that they were passionate about and the things that made them happy and the things that kept them going, especially through trial and tribulation and challenge and loss. And so I think what I wanted to touch on for our audience is just the importance of passion and developing passion. And of course, you so well articulated those of the three women, but you also have your own in showing and writing this book and showing it and sharing it with the world. So could you talk about passion, and could you talk about the importance of cultivating one for young Black women and just young people in general? What does that look like?
Another beautiful question, Melanie. I'll start by saying that just to kind of give a teaser for who the three women were and what they were passionate about, so we know a little bit more about their backgrounds. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own, and then that importance. So you might have to keep me on track because there's three parts of that. that
Good thing.
But first, with Alberta King, who is MLK Jr.'s mother, she, again, long before her children are a thought in her mind, is an activist herself. So her parents were the leaders of Ebenezer Baptist Church. So she grows up thinking about how faith is intertwined with social justice, that if you believe you're a religious leader, then you must also stand against oppression, against racism, against poverty. And the way in which you can stand up against these inequities is through marches and through boycotts. And she's a member of the NAACP. She's a member of all these organizations that are about activism and about change. She's really passionate about becoming a teacher. She even has degrees to become a teacher. She has her bachelor's degree as well as a teaching certificate. And she's also an instrumentalist and a singer. So this woman who does so many incredible things, these are ways in which we can get to know Alberta. And of course, you can see some of those connections in what we know about MLK Jr. I won't say too much about her story because it's all in the book. So we'll move on to Louise Little. Louise Little is someone who's really inspired by her grandparents primarily. They were at one point enslaved, and then they were able to gain their freedom. And so they teach her the importance of Black independence and Black pride and standing up for ourselves by any means necessary. So Louise Little is a radical freedom fighter. She really believes that she will not bow down at any point to her oppressor. She speaks very loudly against white supremacy. She's a writer herself. She's well educated. She's multilingual. She was actually born in Grenada abroad. She travels on her own as a teenager to Montreal, Canada, gets on a steamboat on her own, travels across the world, and joins this international movement called the Marcus Garvey movement. And you should look this up. It's a really cool movement that we haven't really heard that much about, but it's very similar to the connections that the Nation of Islam will later continue, hence Malcolm X going and following the Nation of Islam. So that's just something I'll say about Louise Little. And then Bertus Baldwin, she starts her life in a pretty tragic way. Her mother dies either in childbirth or within a couple weeks of Bertus being born. And in this moment of pain, she becomes somebody who actually focuses on healing and how you can progress through pain and progress through grief. And she is also a writer. She believes that through her writing, she can help other people find their healing and face the pain in order to find the light. And so she leaves her little town. It's called Deal Island, Maryland. It's this tiny place. And she leaves when she's a teenager also to kind of take a chance on something new. She's a part of the Great Migration. She arrives in New York in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. So it's just really cool to think about them as these teenagers, these young girls really forming their vision of what's possible for them in this world. And the fact that this is happening in the early 1900s, where it's even harder to be a Black girl than it is now, where it's not something that you can guarantee that you're going to get an education even up to, you know, middle school level. They are fighting for that. Their families are fighting for these 3 young girls to be educated, to be able to try and reach for those dreams. And you'll have to read the book to see if they're able to accomplish those things or what factors get in their way. But I love to just picture those moments where they're just imagining and thinking of having no ceilings and being able to reach for the stars and for the sky. For myself, that was something that was critical. My parents were always invested in my education and always allowing me to see that I could do whatever I wanted to do, and I could kind of imagine whatever career I wanted to have. And they supported me in that. They were very big on you do need to make money to take care of yourself, but they also said you can be creative with how you're going to do that. There's so many careers out there. There's so many paths. There's so many journeys. So as long as your needs are met, be creative. And they were always inspiring me to stand up for what I believed in, to speak for the rights of women, especially women of color. My mom and her work was a lawyer who advocated for women's rights, not only in the US, but around the world. So I really have followed in her footsteps in terms of those passions, but adding to it my own personal understandings and what I've studied in school, etc. So I just think it's really critical, especially for Black girls, because we are so often told, no, you cannot do this. We are not represented in the media as much as we should be. And if we are, then it's this kind of reduction of our identity. And it's just really time that we continue to challenge that and say, I am not going to let this ugliness define me. And instead, I am going to be a part of this generating of a new reality that others are just a little too behind to see. But we are visionaries. Black girls and Black women are, and we're going to continue to be. And each of us in our own unique way will contribute to allowing people kind of to catch up to our vision of what's possible in the world.
I love that. And I think what I wanted to touch on and around this idea of being visionary is how we can think about a path forward for ourselves and how Black women in the Black community can better support one another. I think you really, for me, this book left me with a charge to think about the women in my life that I should be thankful for and you know, in gratitude, in consistent and continual gratitude too, for how they have influenced me and how they have influenced the way that I interact and the way that I see the world. And I think you said it really well. And towards the end on page 200, you say we must also honor Black mothers who are currently doing the work to transform our world. May they be seen, may they be celebrated, and may they be thanked while they're still alive to hear it. And so something that I wanted to discuss with you, and I'll share my own thought really quickly, is just around this charge, is do we see Black mothers and Black womanhood being thanked and celebrated and appreciated in the way that we think it should? And if we do see it, and when we do see it, does it feel right? And so I think for me, I think that there's, of course, so much more work to be done. I think in our own community and amongst ourselves, Black women are really each other's champions. But to want to branch out and talk about even the responsibility that Black men have to better champion Black women, and to it's one challenge that I see in our community. And I think how it feels, at least when you have, you know, anybody cheering you on, I think we can all agree and relate to a time where you have felt just so overwhelmed with emotion because you're doing something that you're passionate about, you're doing something that you're proud about, and you know the people around you are cheering you on, you know that they're in your corner. Yeah. So I wanted to discuss with you, I guess, and hear your opinion on what more we can do, or is it enough? And how do you see that transforming for the next generation as well?
Oh, these are some of my favorite questions ever. I am loving each and every one. There is a lot more for us as a collective to do. But I do want to say, when I was writing this book and I thought about Black girls and Black women who were going to read it, I wanted us to feel seen, to feel respected, to feel represented and heard, and to have a moment of just recognition that we deserve, because I just felt like there were very few places where this happened. So I didn't necessarily want Black women to feel like there's more that we have to do, because I think Black women do so much already. Black girls do so much already. So even just like a moment to relax and say, whew, someone sees me and someone is celebrating me and recognizes my effort and recognizes my identity and is supporting me and cheering me on in my journey. That was really critical. The only charge I would say Black women and Black girls have now is to write our stories, to really stand in the spotlight, be proud of what we're contributing to this world, and not allow people to erase us or silence us, but instead to say, here I am a human being, I am amazing, and this is what I'm contributing to the world and what I want to do and what I'm dreaming of doing, and I'm going to live a long, beautiful, happy life, and I'm not going to let that joy be robbed from me, and I just don't want our stories to be dimmed any longer. And we also can do that for other Black women in our lives, for our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunties, our community mothers, our teachers. Let's tell their stories too. Let's highlight them. Let's make sure the world knows what Black women have done here. And we need to stop allowing our stories to be erased. But beyond that, I want Black women to also say, hey, I've been seen. I deserve some time to rest as well, and be celebrated. So that's that charge. But there's a lot of charges for everyone else who is not a Black girl or a Black woman to do their part. It's true that in our community, we have high levels of domestic violence. There is so much pain, even within our community, that is being thrust upon Black women. And it's really time that others come around us and what we say, it's almost this unspoken truth where people say, oh, well, of course, Black women are the backbone, but the backbone is the one that's not seen. It's the one that's supporting everything else and no one seems to care about it. So we need to start asking Black women, how can we support them? What can we do to protect them? What can we do to acknowledge the fact that, again, they are not these kind of superhumans who can withstand more than everybody else. We need to stop being okay with that and provide interventions and support for what Black girls and Black women are doing. And outside of our Black community, it's entirely about switching policy, making sure that, again, we're voting for things that would make lives easier. This comes back to, even fighting voter suppression, but thinking about, for especially Black women whose families have been interrupted, and many of them are single mothers, we need to think about affordable childcare. We need to think about parental leave, even access to midwives and doulas. I won't get into all of the boring policy today, but there's so much for the world to do for us. And I'm less interested in what we have left to do for the world, because we're already doing, I would argue, everything. So it's now time to flip that on its head and say, what will the world do for Black women?
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I think, and I want to say to you, you definitely were seen and heard. And as a Black girl reading the book, I was in the margins the whole time, like, yes, like just agreeing with what you're saying and really taking in those stories. And I think that it is time for those to be shared and celebrated and better documented for others and also by others, so that they can, the ownership is not always on us to celebrate us. And so one thing I wanted to touch on for any young writers that might be out there is just, how do they start? How do they start talking about themselves? How do they start talking about their experiences and the things around them, and share that with the world? What has, that process been like for you, and where can they begin?
That's so perfect. I love the opportunity to talk about that. I think that each of us has a different journey and a different path. So I'm not the kind of person who's like, this is how you do all these steps in order to get to the finish line. I think that we all have kind of these squiggly lines to get there. So I can just share how writing works for me. And hopefully that can lead to a little bit of inspiration, but don't feel like you have to stick to these stories, but instead just kind of find your own groove if you're somebody who does want to become a writer. Reading was something that was actually, when I was younger, I didn't really love reading. I'm going to be honest. I always found it to be a little taxing and kind of exhausting. But when I started to realize it was because a lot of the works I was being assigned, I just wasn't interested in, and started to kind of form these reading lists that I cared more about, that would kind of bring me life, that I didn't have to only study, hopefully it's okay to say this, older white men. Like, so many reading lists are things that just don't relate to my experience. But instead, there was a need for me to seek out these other Black female writers, and what they were talking about. And there was this whole other world that opened up for me in reading Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Bell Hooks, and some of our more recent ones, Brittany Cooper. We have Melissa Harris Perry. There's just so much for us to have right now, and to make sure we're consuming the work that will give us life rather than kind of exhaust us because we don't understand why it's being prioritized over our own stories. So writing helps, or reading helps a lot with that inspiration. And then I feel like, oh, I have opinions about this. I have something to say about this. I think especially for young girls, we often in the world think that they're not quite ready to discuss some more mature content, or they don't know what's happening in the world. So maybe it's something that they can do when they're in college. And I completely disagree with that. The years that I spent with my students, they were constantly teaching me, and at young ages, we're being exposed to things, whether it's through social media or through the news. Young people are experiencing this, and quite often they're the victims of the things that we're speaking about. And so we also have to give them the tools to analyze that, to reflect upon that, to contribute their thoughts to the conversation. And writing is one way that you can do that. You can blog, you can put things online, you can start writing poetry. You have a tool kind of at your hands that many before us did not have. Burdis did not have a space to publicly post her writings. And so it's only those who are her loved ones who are fortunate enough to have these letters of beautiful writing and prose. But today we actually have more control over that. And we can get that writing out there. If people like to write fan fiction, this is another way that you can start practicing that. And you can start with short stories and maybe eventually build up to an entire book. And it can be fiction, or it can be nonfiction where you're doing research to put stories together. So I would say an exercise, even if you wanted to start one now, is to think about, as you're reading the book, what are the influences in your life? How does the city that you live in contribute to your journey? How does the family that you're a part of contribute to your journey? Who is someone who's a mentor for you and you want to know more about them? And you can kind of start doing these interviews and asking them things that you don't know about them yet, and start to put in this story together of who you are and how you've arrived at your own passions and talents, and what these influences are that you might have not even been aware of before you took the time to ask some questions and write some things down. And that's really just that curiosity that led me to say, hey, this could be my career. I could also get paid for this.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think what you just touched on in terms of connecting to others in order to, identify self is so important, and figuring out who and what has influence on you as you continue to grow and as you continue to learn. And I think that the stories of Burdis, Alberta, and Louise also show that they may have had a very innate focus on healing, an innate focus on education, or pride and empowerment and resistance, and but they could only be those things as they saw them in relation to others, and as they connected to them and were able to then better describe themselves based on their own actions and experiences. So something I think that may be helpful to share with our audience too would be just how do we even do that as younger Black women, as we try to focus on our own paths of education and of healing. And I think you touched on it earlier as well, but self-care, and how do we do that on the daily? And I can start off by saying that one thing I do is I turn off my devices after a certain time at night. If that's, if it's a late work day, if it's a late day doing, catching up on email, whenever I'm done, I'm done. And then I do try to do something like journal or pick up a book, something that will kind of get my mind a little bit active, thinking positively before I rest my head on my pillow and have to start my next day. So just thinking about, what we can share and what kind of tips we may have that would be useful for the audience as well.
Yeah, I love that, because so often, it's exhausting to be a Black girl and a Black woman in the United States. It's really can be very tiring to constantly be reminded that we're not seen in the way we want to be seen, and that there's so much pain and violence out there against our community. And it's really, really critical to think about that joy and reclaiming that joy and not allowing that to be taken from us, and really celebrating who we are, taking that time with our girlfriends, our loved ones, to think about how we want to kind of just prioritize that and prioritize ourselves. And in order to help other people, you can't pour from an empty glass. So I am really big on yoga. I do a lot of yoga, and it's my time to just myself. I have 2 children, as Melanie mentioned. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old, and they are my whole life, and I love them so much. But my husband also knows that I need my time away, and I need my hour where I don't have my phone and I'm in a hot room doing a yoga practice. So I think everyone just needs to find their thing. I also obviously love writing. And even when I'm just writing for pleasure, and it's not going to be a book, it's not going to be an article, it's not going to be something that anyone else sees, it helps me to reflect on what's going on in my life. And other things just are simple. I love watching TV. Like I don't really like to be busy all the time. I'm not the kind of person who's like proud to be busy. Like I have so much going on and I want the whole world to know how much I have going on. Like I do, but have a lot going on, but I would way rather just kind of be relaxing and like sitting and watching something, or sitting at the beach, or watching my kids blow bubbles. Like I'm all about those moments of restoration. And I think if we all can at least find a couple things that brings us that kind of joy, that we should really hold on to it.
Oh, absolutely. Something my mom always says to me is don't let anyone steal your joy. And I think in finding your thing and finding your passion, that is so true. You have to find those things that keep you happy. And even if it's for a split second, it's better for that split second than none at all.
Can I also add to that, actually, like need for us to protect our time as well? Because the thing you'll notice as you're growing up in this world, people will take so much of your time, especially if you're a Black woman. There's this notion of like, oh, she'll just do it for us. She'll be fine. She can take care of that. She'll handle that. And that's just not how it should be. And you have to sometimes just say, I don't think everyone would have accepted this. I'm going to say, no, I can't. I cannot do that. My more recent thing now is saying, unless you're able to even, pay for me to do this and to take my time, I shouldn't have to just say yes. And people expect that of you. So as young Black girls, like if you're ready for that and you're aware that people may just start taking more of your time than they are of anybody else's, you just got to protect it, have your boundaries, and you can say, no, thank you. I might just go watch TV instead. And that's all right.
Absolutely. I think protecting your boundaries is extremely important. As a recent college graduate, I had to adjust and figure that out in a new setting. And any time you enter a new space, it's important to take a beat and figure out, okay, where do I fit in? Where do I want to fit in? And, how can I make that a reality for me at this time, even if you have to then kind of force other people to change their behavior to make you feel as comfortable as you should feel in any space you enter in. That's really key.
I love that.
So as we wrap up, I wanted to just take a second and think about any key thing that you would want readers to focus on and our audience to take away from each of the 3 stories of Alberta King, Bernice Baldwin, and Louise Little. I think we may have a lot of audience members who need to get a copy of the book and get into it. But what would those key things be that you would want readers to focus on, you know, as the author? What is the goal?
So many goals. When I wrote this book, so many. There's so many goals. I'll try to summarize some of them. A big one is a really simple claim that we are human beings, and we deserve recognition. And so going back to that thing I said around MLK Jr. and his birthday, we shouldn't think of MLK Jr. as if he's some kind of deity or this kind of like godlike figure, but instead as a human being. He was birthed by somebody. He was a person. And we also need to know who that person was, who birthed and raised him, because we better appreciate her humanity as well as his. And by doing that, we then also think about our connection to him. Again, he was not some separate entity that existed on his own. He was rooted in his family, in his community, in the family that he also formed with Coretta. All of that is critical in our appreciation of who he was. So it's not to rob our love of Martin Luther King. It's not to replace him in our attention and say, let's focus on Alberta instead. It's to say, we better appreciate him. We better appreciate ourselves. And we better appreciate Alberta when we study all the different people around us, when we appreciate all the different factors that have made us who we are today. So a very simple claim around humanity and not allowing that to be taken from us. And then secondly, a goal, especially as I'm speaking to young Black women, that you and your passions and your talent and your joy and the love that you will find in life and that you have now with your family and with your friends are so critical and so important to the survival of our entire nation, that I want you to prioritize yourselves as well and make sure, like I said before, stand in that light, be proud of who you are, hold your head up high, know that what you are doing right now and everything that you're, practicing to be and dreaming of being is essential. And I celebrate you. I applaud you, even when the world does not see you and does not appreciate you in that way. I hope you'll come to this book and hear me speaking to you. I really wrote this for you and to celebrate you and to not give you more responsibilities other than to celebrate yourself.
Beautiful. And I think I just want to end with a quote from your author's note where you say, I'm not only recognizing them, but also recognizing those like them, other people who have been marginalized and other people who have been forgotten. Through piecing together evidence of their lives, I'm hopeful this new knowledge will help others in our society continue to grow. And I think you just, I echoed you twice now, because that's the message you just left us with. And that is the message that you leave your reader with at the end of your book as well, just to keep going and to keep thinking about these things and how you fit in and how you relate to other people and appreciate them. And I can see your passion around that subject, and I can see how it inspires others, and just as it has inspired me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you so much for this interview. Each and every question was so beautiful and so thoughtful. I really appreciate it.
Of course, you gave me a lot to think about, so I'm glad.
I'm going to jump back in here. Hello? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anna. This was amazing. I cannot wait to read this book. Mel, I'm so proud of you. You rock. The conversation was so thought-provoking, and it was so impactful and powerful. And obviously, Anna, you're speaking to my mission, to empower and let Black girls be seen. So I really love it. And I thank you because the audience out there, Anna and her team have donated a number of books. So for the schools, we will be sending you your own book if you don't have it already. So yay. And I think you all are going to stay for our workshop. Yeah, perhaps.
Correct.
Okay, yes. So we're moving to our workshop portion. Remember, everyone, you can follow us on Black Girls Rock everywhere, Facebook, YouTube, IG, and we will be going to workshop, and then we'll give you some more information about our next book club. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Bye, everyone.